Of course, de Gaulle understood that it was in France's best interest to have more of a cooperative relationship with the United States, that they both had much more in common and really had a common enemy in terms of the Soviet Union. But part of de Gaulle's kind of antagonism towards the United States at times came from the fact that, one, he had a very, very negative relationship with Franklin Roosevelt during the Second World War. He had always felt the Americans had not done enough to try and help him, promote him as the leader of France during the war, and he felt that would have solved a lot of problems. So he kind of retained some bitterness towards the United States because of that. He also felt, of course, and you might, depending on how you view things, he also felt that the United States, while the Soviet Union was an obvious threat to the future of Western Europe, the United States in the here and now was actually much more intrusive in terms of its influence on Western European domestic policies, and therefore it was right that France took some efforts to try and counterbalance outsized American influence in Europe. To that end, he sought to collaborate more with the various allies of Europe, in particular with West Germany. So this is de Gaulle here pictured with Konrad Adenauer, the German Chancellor, in the 50s and 1960s. He hoped that by working more closely with the various European allies, that they could do more to ensure their kind of political and economic independence and able to avoid undue, what de Gaulle felt was undue American influence on European society in general. He was, in the end, of course, it was de Gaulle hoped that Europeans would be able to kind of shed any kind of political and economic reliance upon the United States. He only later kind of realized that Germany in particular was obviously very dependent upon American assistance in defending itself against the Soviet Union and in developing its economy. So the European Union, the European community, did not end up being quite shedding as much of the American influence as de Gaulle hoped to do so. Of course, one of his most significant contributions to the European Union in the 1960s was to refuse, in 1963 and again in 1967, permission for the United Kingdom to join with the European community. De Gaulle felt that the British were not really invested in a pan-European project. They weren't really fully committed to what the other European countries were trying to achieve. And we might say, with the benefit in hindsight, that maybe de Gaulle was correct about that. But anyway, the British were refused to entry to join the European community because de Gaulle vetoed it twice in the 1970s. So and this is obviously from a German cartoon here, saying, nicht for Engländer, not for the English. His most obvious, rebuke of American influence in Europe came in NATO. De Gaulle basically had been insisting that he basically felt NATO was too dominated by American, that the Americans should agree to kind of work, essentially set up a tripartite leadership position involving the United States, France, and the United Kingdom, that they should kind of make decisions together about NATO's future rather than America being kind of the single dominant power. The United States, not surprisingly, didn't want to lose its influence in that sense, and refused de Gaulle's overtures. And so in 1966, de Gaulle basically announced, well, then France is withdrawing its soldiers from NATO. Not fully leaving NATO, France politically remained part of NATO, but it refused to serve in any NATO combat missions. And so in 1966, France technically, or not technically, but de facto, if not de jure, withdrew from NATO. An act which shocked many Americans, shocked many people in NATO in general. But again, I guess was evidence once more of de Gaulle's willingness to preserve French independence and to avoid what he saw as overt American influence on French policy. He continued to kind of provoke the United States. In 1966, he declared that as the American mission in Vietnam was escalating, he declared that the Vietnam War was an unjust war, a detestable war, since it leads a powerful nation to destroy a small one. Not surprisingly, that comment did not go down very well in Washington, and was kind of another sign of de Gaulle's efforts to maintain French independence. Another example of his kind of willingness to stir controversy came in 1967 when the Arab-Israeli war broke out. He imposed an arms embargo on Israel. Essentially was giving assistance to the various Arab states. He made a comment that the Jews were always kind of too sure of themselves, and that comment obviously spoke a great deal of controversy in France. Another one of his controversial forays into foreign policy came in 1967 when he visited Canada, and in a speech he gave at Montreal, he basically declared "Vive le Québec libre," long live free Quebec, which was seen as a not very subtle endorsement of Quebec independence from Canada. Obviously, as you're probably aware, Quebec has a French-speaking majority in Canada, and so by de Gaulle endorsing French or Quebec kind of independence did not very sit well with the Canadian government that was hosting him as their guest. So I mentioned earlier on that de Gaulle had also created his own new political party or a new political movement, the Union for a New Republic. In the elections of 1958, you can see here the Union for the New Republic captured 189 seats, so it became the largest party. And this kind of initiated what we sometimes call in French history as Gaullism. Gaullism is kind of an interesting mix of, we might say, to some extent, conservative policy. Certainly, one of the most important aspects of Gaullism was the maintenance of French independence on the international scene. Its economic policies, on the one hand, were about developing the French economy and ensuring that French business was very, very competitive. But by doing so, in that sense, we might see it as somewhat associated with the politics of the right, but also that the French government would play a hands-on role in ensuring the French economy was competitive. So that aspect of it was something more from the political left. So kind of an interesting hodgepodge of different ideas connected this obviously with the personality of de Gaulle himself. And even after de Gaulle leaves the political scene, this Gaullism is to remain an important force in French politics until the end of the 20th century. So here we have the Union of New Republic, was the largest party in 1958, and gave de Gaulle a solid majority, or not an overall majority, but a large voting bloc to support his policies during the 1960s. After the various attempts to assassinate de Gaulle in the early 1960s, he also decided to modify the office of the presidency, basically to change from the electoral college system that he had created in 1958 to shifting towards direct elections for the French president. So actually the French had this electoral college system but never actually worked in the Fifth Republic because de Gaulle held a referendum in 1962 to replace the method in which presidents were elected by direct vote and by popular vote. And so you can see here it was voted by a large majority of the French population supported this proposal, and de Gaulle felt this was important because it would allow future presidents essentially to have a mandate from the people and therefore to maintain the kind of strength of the office, the executive office of the presidency. Because when de Gaulle initially created the constitution, there was some kind of debate, at least as the constitution was written, about who would really make the decisions for France. Would it be the president or the prime minister? And then obviously being the force of de Gaulle's own personality that had led it to being the president initially, but by shifting towards popular vote, he was ensuring that going forward the French president would remain the dominant single force on French policy, simply because he or she would have a direct mandate from the French people themselves. He also tried to tackle French economic problems. Again, the kind of bugbear of the French economy for much of the 20th century was inflation. And in order to resolve the problems of inflation in 1960, I'm just trying to judge something here. In the early 1960s, he introduced the new French franc. So the new French franc was basically worth, so every new French franc, what was called a heavy franc, was worth one of was worth 100 of the old French franc. So essentially consolidated the French franc and made it a kind of more powerful currency again. And this, along with kind of pretty strict budget cuts, helped reduce French inflation and helped protect some of the gains that the French economy had made during the 1950s. Not only protect them, to enhance them and set a stage where the French economy continued to grow in the 1960s. He was also charged with trying to take steps to prepare France for the challenges of the common market and sharing with the rest of Europe. So taking steps to reform French agriculture and French business. What this effectively meant was removing some of the older emphasis on protections that offered to small French farmers and small French business owners. Long story short, de Gaulle and this Gaullist economic policy realized that if French businesses want to be competitive, they need to be large enough to stand against international corporations. And there was no point having small little farms and small little businesses that were never big enough, never had enough capital to compete against bigger producers, bigger businesses elsewhere. So this meant firstly withdrawing some of the traditional financial incentives for French farmers, for encouraging French farmers to kind of merge their farms or sell their farms to bigger producers. And this had some success. In fact, by 1981, France was the second largest producer or exporter of food anywhere in the world. But also, it was so successful indeed that they were creating these enormous surpluses of food. So this is this is not what the cartoon here is referring to, the European Economic Community above a mountain, but France was producing vast numbers, overproducing dairy products in particular, overproducing many of its food products. And what this meant was the French government essentially had to provide subsidies to the French farmers to cut back on their production in order to maintain the prices artificially high so that their standard of living did not fall. The French economy also increased dramatically in the 1960s. So between 1959 and 1970, the French economy was growing at about 6% a year, which is a very strong rate of growth. I mean, in our day and age, an economy that's growing at about 3% a year was considered very, very robust. So 6% a year was very significant. Again, this was by taking steps to firstly remove traditional protectionist policies that protected small French businesses, encouraging French businesses to merge to become larger so they can compete internationally. And just to give you an example of this, the first supermarket didn't open in France until 1963, because traditionally all French food was sold through your local shopkeeper, and so not these larger supermarkets. Another innovation of the French Republic, the Fifth Republic under de Gaulle, was the increase of national highways, so 4-lane highways. We obviously have seen before the influence of French road building and it's connecting various corners of France and kind of promoting a uniform French culture. But these roads were oftentimes kind of small, single lane or dual lane. So France dramatically increases its infrastructure to help facilitate with business growth as well. Most of the decisions the French state was taking were kind of more practical decisions to try and increase economic productivity. They sometimes could be encouraged to fall into vanity projects. Perhaps the best example would be this one. So this Anglo-French design, supersonic passenger airline, flew transatlantic routes from 1969 to 2003, excuse me, not 1973. And the answer is, what is Concorde? That was an example of French investment in an industry that financially wasn't particularly successful, but was a demonstration of French innovation. And that was important for de Gaulle, that French engineers were to be encouraged to not simply compete economically, but to try and find essentially French ways of doing things. So in this case, French engineering to not just follow American formats for mass producing airplanes, but to create something new and uniquely French as well. So combining modernity, economic competitiveness, and also kind of a sense of French pride. So the Concorde, if you're not aware, was able to fly from London to New York in 3 hours, which modern airline flights do not do nearly as quickly as that. Yet there was still a growing awareness in the Fifth Republic that more needed to be done. So one of the most famous works of the 1960s in France was The American Challenge by Jean-Jacques Servan-Schreiber, where he basically said France's problem was that it was still not willing to embrace American innovation, American kind of entrepreneurial spirits, that too many old ways were still lagging behind or hanging on despite the efforts of de Gaulle to encourage modernization. And if France was to survive, it needed to adopt a more American attitude towards business and finance. And so this kind of concludes this lecture on the Fifth Republic. And basically, we might see that the early first decade of the Fifth Republic was a success. De Gaulle had reformed France's political institutions and certainly introduced greater stability, greater direction for the French government, while also helping kind of set the stage for a new, more modernized French economy that was growing at a tremendous rate and allowing France to become one of the wealthiest, most advanced nations in the Western world.